Well, thank you for having me here. It's always nice to see a bunch of young faces very interested in media. The talk that I'm going to be giving is called Displacing Time and Space. And what I'm going to be talking about today is somewhat abstract, and I'm going to explain it to you a little bit, then I'm going to show you what it looks like in actual application, in use, in movies. The kinds of work that I make is often called post-cinema, sometimes new aesthetic or even post-digital. What that means is, unlike traditional film, which is made using photographs, actual photographs, projected at a high speed, typically 24 frames a second, I work with digital technology and digital media, and I engage with it in a way that foregrounds, that makes you aware of the fact that what you're looking at is a product of computation, a product of digital machines, and whatever it is that they do. That means that some of the work I work with, some of the materials that I use, is called glitch. Things like this. This is a glitch from 1990. It's a piece of one of my old works. Since then, I have used glitches in a variety of ways. Here are some still pictures. But this is mostly as material rather than as finished work. So while these are kind of dynamic and interesting, they are also largely autonomous. They're produced simply by the machine doing what the machine is going to do when it runs. So while this provides me with material, it does not provide me with finished work. These are not completed works really per se, but either pieces of finished works that you're looking at right now, or raw footage used in the production of other finished work. As Linus said, I'm what's sometimes referred to as an artist theorist or a practitioner theorist. In my case, that means something fairly complex. My work is divided really between several phases that interlock. On the one hand, you have the process, and in that process, I spend a lot of my time doing research. I spend a lot of my time engaged with ideation and thought and analysis. This produces, among other things, some of the books that Linus showed you. And it leads to tests and applications in a number of other ways, which you can see over here on the left. My left, your right. Which is to say, critical theory, historical writing of various kinds, and applied theory or heuristic theory, as well as obviously the creation of motion pictures. As a result, I write a lot. Here are some of my books. What I'm going to be talking about today is work that was published several years ago in this book, a book called Beyond Spatial Montage, Windowing, or the Cinematic Displacement of Time, Motion, and Space. This is a project I worked on for some time. It began in 1989 and was finished with the publication of this book in 2015. The central focus of this book is what I call displacements. And I know this is all very abstract, and it will become much more concrete when I start showing you work, but I want to give you some sense of what it is I'm talking about, or what the theory is, let's say, before I show you the work. Now, displacements come in a variety of flavors: displacements of time, displacements of motion, or displacements of space by themselves, things like editing or continuity cuts and so forth that you're familiar with from everyday cinema, are only one kind of displacement. And my interest has to do with the hybrids, the overlaps between these various everyday displacements. And that's what gives me the three components that are of interest to my work: time, motion, and space. Time being the time of editing, the constructed time that happens when you break a scene or a sequence of shots and then assemble them to produce an edited montage. Motion, for my consideration, is continuous motion, the movement within shots. And this gives you the range from the long take where you have almost no editing and everything is staged continuously, to the very fragmented, compartmentalized motion of continuity. And then we have space. Most of the time in cinema, we're only looking at single frames, a single screen like you see here. But there are variations on this called expanded cinema, where you have multiple screens that may be placed around one another, distributed through space, or even overlapping. And then within that construct, the single frame, you can break it up into what are effectively multiple screens, multiple images, which you can then manipulate or combine. And thinking about space in that way gives me the two parameters that I then use to construct everything else. And like I said, this is all very abstract, and once you see it in application, it will be really obvious what I'm talking about right now. You have the idea of single image, where it's one frame fills the entire screen, or multiple images broken up into discrete frames composited together on screen. And then they have either the affect, that is to say, when you look at it, it either looks like one single image or multiple images. You're either looking at a superimposed collection of things, which is visual effects compositing, or you're looking at its fragmentation. Now, I'm going to show you a bunch of movies today produced over a good chunk of this 25-year period, including a couple of things that are a little bit more contemporary, that were produced after I finished the book. The first of these is produced with analog technology back in the 1990s. This piece is from 1996. It's called Action Movie. It uses a variety of things that in video art were called wipes, which you may have heard in some of your compositing classes, or if you've looked at broadcasting, you may have heard of wipes there. A wipe is basically what you see in the screen right here, these bands of image that allow you to have several discrete pictures composited together. In the case of Action Movie, this rapidly becomes much more complex. And while Action Movie is in some ways very much unsuccessful, mostly because of the limitations of analog technology, it sets the stage for the later work that I'm going to be showing you produced digitally. So we'll start with this one. It has a dog. Okay, that movie obviously did not have sound. But the next group, in fact, the majority of the movies I'm going to show you today are synchronized with their sound, and sound is very important to them. Sound provides a fundamental syntactic function in motion pictures. It lets you break it up into sequences, it lets you understand how it's organized, it lets you keep track of what's going on. Very often it will tell you what it means, even if there isn't a voiceover telling you what it means. Synchronization works in a variety of very complex ways, and because the work that I produce comes out of a tradition called visual music, in which abstract, typically, visuals are organized as a visual structure directly analogous to what you hear, the issue of sound and synchronization is a little bit of something I want to talk about before I move into these movies. The first piece I'm going to show you is called Telemetry. I'm going to show you an excerpt from it. It runs about half an hour. This excerpt is only about 10 minutes. It's a piece that explores in rather direct and complex ways these fragmentations and composited structures that you see implied in action movie. Like I said, action movie is not entirely successful. The limitations of analog technology are quite serious there. This piece is much more successful. It's produced with digital compositing technology and algorithmic animation in which the animated forms are generated, and then the generated animation is carved up into pieces and reassembled to produce the movie. But in being reassembled, it's synchronized with the sound. So I want you to pay attention to the sound as well as the picture. It's very easy to just say, oh, there's music, and either like the music or dislike the music, or say, oh, look, there's a picture, but not realize that the two are correlated, that they align with one another. And that alignment is something that's actually fairly significant for my work. So, Telemetry. Here are some stills from it. Like I said, this is an excerpt from a much longer piece. It's composed from 24 independent and carefully sequenced modules that play as a continuous piece. So here's an excerpt. that video is kind of long, and I'm not going to be showing you anything else of this length today. But this is a very important piece for the kinds of things that we're going to be seeing in the rest of the pieces we're going to look at. So the next one, for those of you who don't particularly like abstraction, this next video features a rabbit. People like rabbits, right? So here it is. You're going to see these same kinds of repetitions and fragments, displacements, and dynamic shifting of speed and duration that you saw in the abstract piece play out here with live action footage. Related to what happens in all of those pieces that we've seen so far are issues about image fragmentation and recognition, the way in which you make a coherent picture out of all of these various pieces that you're seeing. And that's what the piece we're going to look at now engages with. This is a work of visual music that engages with the production of kaleidoscopic forms, repetitions, and fragmentation. This, what you see on screen here, is not one picture. It's 9 individual screen grabs at different points in the duration or development of the next piece. This work is constructed as a piece of visual music quite explicitly. It's organized by its soundtrack. You may even recognize some of the glitch footage that we saw at the very beginning in this piece. Okay. So much for art, right? Because what we've been looking at are quite specifically and literally art video. This is the kind of work that you see in museums, the sort of stuff you see in art galleries. This is not entertainment media. So if you're having trouble watching it, as I think some of you might be, that's because it doesn't play by the rules that you expect for entertainment media, because it's not entertainment media. In fact, the assumptions and the ways that you watch for entertainment media are one of the things that all of this work is playing with. It's challenging, in many cases undermining or specifically playing games with what you expect it to do, then it does something slightly different. And this is especially true when we look at things that are narrative, that tell stories or seem to tell stories, or move around the space that we think of as being storytelling. And that's the case with the next several pieces we're going to be looking at. It's one of the things that's become increasingly of interest to me as this project neared completion. Because after all, this is a 25-year project we've been looking at. All of the work up to this point has been very much a formal engagement with the arrangement and displacement and construction of all of our fragmentary pieces, the ways that we can put together our images on screen. The question that arises once you figure out how to do that is, well, can we tell stories with it? Is it possible to use this in an analogous fashion with narrative? And as it turns out, the answer is yes. Now, the next piece we're going to see involves a narrative component, but it's much more subtle than what you see in the first piece, this contact light that we just watched. This piece is a kind of chase. It's a graphic animated chase in which we have abstract forms, and we have a recognizable collection of imagery as well, abstracted but still recognizable, and they chase each other, synchronized with music. At the beginning of the 20th century, in Paris, an American dancer named Loie Fuller was performing something called a serpentine dance. This performance was filmed in 1896 by the Lumiere brothers, and that footage provides the foundation for what we're going to look at in this next video. What's of interest about the serpentine dance is the ways in which it influences the invention of abstract art, in particular cubism, the various swirls and fragmentations of figures that we see in cubist paintings of 1908, 1909, 1910, are related to the kinds of things that you can see in the serpentine dance. And so this piece, called Dancing Glitch, is an animated and digital exploration of that relationship set to music. The video you're going to watch next is a music video. This is a piece of commercial work that I was contacted and then commissioned to produce. It's a piece that takes all of the things that we've been looking at and makes them much more complex. It's a elaboration, perhaps an intensification is a better word, of the kinds of things that we saw in Dancing Glitch. One of the things that interested me about that piece, after I finished it, that was perhaps the most striking thing about it, is that there are no edits. There are no cuts of any kind. Instead, it's a continuous stream uninterrupted, unfragmented, unbroken. And that was of interest, very much so. Shortly after finishing that piece, I started working on this one here called the Kodak Moment. This video uses a piece of very old footage from the 1920s, a piece of footage originally made not for any purpose other than simply to see if color works. It's a Kodachrome test film produced in 1920 and 1921 to see if you can actually put color on motion pictures. It was made in New Jersey at the Kodak Laboratory. It features a silent film star named Mae Murray, who's really not well known today. But in the course of working with the footage, one of the things that struck me, even the first time I saw it, was that this is footage that you could edit to produce a standard continuity sequence in which she turns towards the camera and turns away from the camera. That idea became the foundation for this dismantling of editing, of continuity, even of continuous motion. So here it is. Kodak Moment took nearly a year to produce. It was enormously labor intensive. While I was working on it, the Beyond Spatial Montage windowing book was nearing completion. And in the course of finishing the manuscript, I realized that despite everything I had been doing for 25 years, I was still missing one of the pieces I needed to finish the book. I was still missing a particular kind of displacement, which is where this comes in. Once I had worked out all of this stuff, all of this ideas and ideation, this work about windowing, project I've been working on for 25 years. The question once you finish a project like that is, what do I do now? It's done. You spent 25 years on this. What do you do with it next? Where do you go? Well, that's where the next collection of works come. These first two pieces we're going to see are in some ways preparatory studies. They are in some ways sketches, even though they are completed, finished works, and they've actually screened quite a lot. These are pieces that prepare for the last thing I'm going to show you today, which is the current project I'm working on. These videos, the last three I'm showing you, are pieces where visual effects and motion graphics kind of collide with video art and media art in the experimental film. They also let me really explore some of my ongoing interests. In the early 1960s, when Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to go into orbit, as he was getting ready to take off, he radioed the tower, joking about whether, well, really asking the question, whether he was the last space dog to take off or the first man to go into orbit. That's because in the 1950s, the Soviets weren't sure if anything alive could survive going into orbit, could survive free fall. And so where the Americans were firing apes into space and monkeys and so on, the Soviets thought it would be far more photogenic to fire dogs into space. And so we have a great many dogs being loaded onto rockets and fired into orbit. This next video uses footage of Belka and Strelka, the first two space dogs to successfully go into orbit and then return, as a kind of homage. Alright, last video. This is one of the episodes from an ongoing project of mine that I've been working on now for about 2 years. It's a parody of science fiction stories, science fiction movies. It's called Going Somewhere. And I think you will recognize much of what we've seen earlier today in this piece, just like in the last one. Thank you.